The metallic clang of boots on steel deck echoed through the cool dawn air as Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka stepped out onto the flight deck of the Imperial Japanese Navy carrier Shinano. It was just past 0500 hours, and the Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, a shifting expanse of silver and blue beneath a thin veil of mist. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the American fleet, and with it, the future of Japan's war effort. Hiroshi tightened the strap of his flight harness and adjusted his pilot's gloves, breathing in the salty, oily scent of the carrier deck. Around him, the deck swarmed with life. Ground crews checked engines and refueled aircraft. Ordnance teams loaded bombs beneath wings, and pilots gathered in clusters, speaking in low voices about the mission ahead. The rising sun insignia painted on the fuselages of their Mitsubishi A6M0s caught the first light of morning, glowing like blood in the dawn. Tanaka. Hiroshi turned to see Sub-Lieutenant Kenji Sato, his longtime friend and wingman, jogging toward him with a broad grin that did little to hide the tension in his eyes. They had trained together, flown together, and shared countless hours in the cramped cockpits of their fighters. In war, such bonds were rare and precious. "O genki desu ka?" Kenji asked. "Are you well?" "As well as anyone about to fly into hell," Hiroshi replied, with a faint smile. Kenji's grin faltered. "Do you think we'll come back this time?" The question hung in the air between them like a ghost. Both men knew the answer. Their squadron's orders were clear. Launch a surprise strike against the enemy carrier group operating near the Marianas. Intelligence was scarce, but everyone expected heavy resistance. Fuel reserves were low, meaning most pilots wouldn't have enough to return. If they survived the dogfight, they might still be forced to ditch into the sea. And if captured, death was preferable. Or so they had always been told. "Whether we return or not," Hiroshi said at last, "our duty is unchanged." Kenji nodded, his expression hardening into something like resolve. "Tenno heika banzai." "Banzai," Hiroshi echoed softly. A shrill whistle cut through the air, summoning the pilots to briefing. Inside the cramped operations room, the air buzzed with cigarette smoke and tension. A massive map of the Pacific dominated the far wall, dotted with pins and markings indicating enemy positions. Commander Okabe, a grizzled veteran of Midway and Coral Sea, stood at the front, his eyes like cold steel. "Gentlemen," he began, "today you carry the fate of our nation on your wings." He pointed to a cluster of pins, American carrier positions east of Guam. "Our scouts report a large enemy task force here. 2 carriers, 3 cruisers, multiple destroyers. They will strike the homeland if we do not stop them. Your mission, cripple their air power before they close the distance." The room was silent, but for the scratching of pencils and the rustle of maps. Hiroshi memorized the flight path, the attack formation, the rendezvous points. Every detail mattered, though deep down he knew that once they engaged, plans would dissolve into chaos. "Remember," Okabe continued, his voice dropping lower, "capture is not an option. Should you fall into enemy hands, you will bring dishonor to your family, your emperor, and yourselves. You must fight until the end, and if the end comes, embrace it with dignity." No one spoke. No one had to. They all knew the code. Death before surrender. An hour later, Hiroshi stood beside his Zero on the deck, the rising sun now a blazing orange disk above the horizon. The ground crew gave him a thumbs up. Fuel tanks full, ammunition loaded, bombs secured. He climbed into the cockpit, settling into the worn leather seat that had become a second home over the past 3 years. The engine roared to life, trembling beneath him like a caged animal eager for the sky. The deck crew removed the chocks, and the deck officer signaled with his flag, "Shinju o Tamotsu." Hiroshi whispered, "Protect my spirit." Kenji's voice crackled over the radio. "Tanaka, I'll be on your right wing. Let's give them a fight they'll never forget." Hiroshi allowed himself a faint smile. "Hi, together, always." The signal came. Green flag. The deck tilted slightly as the Shinano turned into the wind. Then, with a deafening roar, Hiroshi pushed the throttle forward. The Zero leapt ahead, racing down the deck. Wind tore at his flight helmet. The sea rushed below, and then freedom. The Zero lifted into the morning sky, joining the formation of rising sun emblems cutting eastward toward destiny. Below, the Shinano grew smaller and smaller until it was just a dot on the vast Pacific. Ahead, the clouds waited, and beyond them, the enemy. Hiroshi glanced once at the small photograph tucked into his cockpit frame, his mother and younger sister smiling beneath a cherry blossom tree back home in Tokyo. "For you," he whispered. The radio crackled with final instructions, but Hiroshi barely heard them. His thoughts were far away. Of duty, of honor, of the possibility that he might never again see those faces or walk beneath those blossoms. They had been told that Japan's victory depended on their sacrifice, and so they flew not just for themselves, but for a nation's dream. One last desperate gamble written in fire and steel. Above the endless sea, the mission of no return had begun. The Pacific stretched endlessly below the formation of rising sun insignias, shimmering like polished steel under the morning sun. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka scanned the sky, his gloved hand steady on the stick, as his Zero hummed through the thin air. The sea, calm and indifferent, belied the violence that was about to erupt above it. "Formation, tighten up," came Commander Okabe's voice over the radio, clipped and authoritative. "Target sighted ahead, 20 nautical miles. Stay sharp." Hiroshi's heart drummed against his ribs. Ahead, faint plumes of smoke began to rise over the horizon, the first sign of the American carrier group. Anticipation and dread coiled inside him, twin snakes twisting together. This was what he had trained for. This was why he had sworn his life to the Emperor. "Kenji," Hiroshi called on the squadron channel. "Are you with me?" "Right here, Senpai," Kenji replied, voice calm but strained. "Let's show them the strength of the Imperial Navy." Hiroshi smiled faintly beneath his oxygen mask. They had survived so many sorties together. Raids over Guadalcanal, dogfights over the Solomons, but never had the stakes been so high. This time, there would be no safe return, no friendly airstrip awaiting for them. Only the sea, contact, enemy fighters. High and fast, 11 o'clock, came a shout over the radio. The sky ahead erupted in chaos. Dark specks grew larger with alarming speed. F-6F Hellcats, diving from altitude, their wings bristling with machine guns. American Combat Air Patrol, the hunters, had arrived. Break formation. "Totsugeki, attack," Okabe barked. The calm, ordered world of formation flying dissolved into madness. Hiroshi rolled hard left, the G-forces pressing his chest as tracer rounds streaked past his canopy. The first wave of Zeros split into pairs, twisting and looping through the sky in a deadly dance. The Americans dove with brutal efficiency, using their superior speed to slash through the formation and climb again. "On your tail, Hiroshi." Kenji's voice jolted through the radio. Hiroshi yanked the stick, rolling inverted, and pulling into a dive. A Hellcat thundered past, overshooting, and Hiroshi seized the moment. He pulled up behind the blue-painted enemy and squeezed the trigger. The Zero's twin 20mm cannons spat fire. The Hellcat's right wing exploded in a burst of flame, and the enemy spiraled into the sea below. "One down," Hiroshi muttered, his pulse racing. Too many left, but there was no time to celebrate. Another Hellcat appeared from nowhere, its guns stitching a deadly line of tracer fire across his tail. Warning lights flickered on the control panel. Rudder control damaged. He rolled desperately, the Zero groaning under the strain. Kenji swooped in like a hawk, his guns blazing. The American peeled away, trailing smoke. "Arigato," Hiroshi shouted. "Don't thank me yet," Kenji replied. "We're not even close to the target." The Runnymede, the chaos, the carrier group came into view. Massive gray beasts plowing through the waves, deck crews scrambling, anti-aircraft guns swiveling upward like a forest of iron teeth. Black puffs of flak blossomed in the sky, shaking Hiroshi's aircraft as he descended into the storm. "Target in sight." "Commence bombing run," Okabe's voice roared through the static. Hiroshi leveled his Zero at just under 1,000 meters, lining up on a U.S. destroyer that was zigzagging through the formation. The deck guns erupted in response, shells bursting all around him. Shrapnel rattled off his fuselage, tearing holes in his wings. The cockpit filled with acrid smoke. He focused through the haze, thumb hovering over the bomb release. "Now," he whispered. The Zero jolted as the bomb fell away, tumbling toward the ship below. Seconds later, a brilliant orange explosion ripped across the destroyer's stern, sending men and debris flying skyward. A cheer erupted over the radio, fleeting, frantic. "Good hit! Good hit!" But victory was short-lived. The Americans responded with overwhelming force. F-6Fs swarmed like hornets. Flak thickened until the sky itself seemed to explode. A sudden violent impact rocked Hiroshi's Zero. Warning alarms screamed. The engine coughed and belched flame, control failing. "Losing altitude," he shouted. "Bail out, Hiroshi. Bail out now." Kenji's voice was distant, panicked. "I can't. She's still flying." Another explosion closer this time. The canopy cracked, and a wave of hot air blasted through the cockpit. The controls were sluggish, barely responding. The Zero began to spiral. With shaking hands, Hiroshi fought the stick, leveling the plane long enough to unbuckle his harness. Wind howled as he jettisoned the canopy and climbed onto the seat. For a moment the world slowed. The endless sea below, the burning ships, the scattered wreckage of friend and foe. "Forgive me," he whispered to the Emperor, to his family, to Kenji. Then he jumped. The fall. The wind tore at him as he plummeted through the sky, the roar of battle fading into silence. Seconds stretched into eternity before his parachute snapped open with a violent jolt. He drifted downward, the sea rising to meet him. Around him, the Pacific was a graveyard. Smoke rose from burning ships. Pieces of aircraft floated like driftwood. A lone Zero spiraled into the waves, its final scream swallowed by the ocean. Hiroshi hit the water hard, the shock stealing his breath. Salt water filled his mouth as he struggled free of his harness and clung to a piece of wreckage. The sun was climbing higher now, but the water was cold, merciless. "Kenji," he murmured, scanning the horizon, but there was no sign of his friend. Only debris and distant explosions. Hours passed. He drifted aimlessly, his limbs heavy, his mind slipping between consciousness and oblivion. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face, his sister's laughter, the cherry blossoms falling like snow. This was the end, he thought. A warrior's death, no dishonor, no capture, just the sea. But fate, it seemed, was not yet finished with Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka. To be continued in the next chapter. Hiroshi's expectations of death and honor will be shattered when the enemy, the Americans he was sworn to kill, reach down into the cold Pacific and offer him a hand. The sea was merciless. For hours, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka drifted amid oil-slicked water and floating wreckage, clinging to a twisted piece of fuselage that once belonged to his beloved Zero. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, indifferent wilderness of water and sky. The smell of burning fuel clung to the air, mingling with salt and smoke. The battle had long since passed. The sound of engines, gunfire, and explosions had faded into the distance, leaving only the lapping of waves and the occasional groan of sinking steel. The sun climbed higher, scorching his exposed face, and thirst burned at the back of his throat. Time lost meaning. Minutes blurred into hours. He drifted in and out of consciousness, memories and hallucinations weaving together. He saw the face of his mother kneeling in prayer at the family shrine, his little sister chasing fireflies beneath a spring moon. He saw Kenji's grin the morning of their last flight, and then Kenji's Zero vanishing in a plume of smoke. "Kenji," he whispered weakly, his voice nearly lost to the wind. "Where are you?" A sudden sound cut through the silence, the low rhythmic thrum of engines. Hiroshi blinked against the harsh glare of the sun, squinting toward the horizon. At first he thought it was a hallucination, another cruel trick of the dying mind. But then it grew louder, closer. A gray silhouette appeared against the waves, then another. Soon, there was no mistaking it. A fleet of American ships, cutting through the water in formation, their flags snapping sharply in the breeze. Panic surged through him. Americans. He'd been told what happened to captured pilots. His instructors had filled his head with grim warnings. Torture, humiliation, dishonor beyond death. Surrender was unthinkable. To be captured alive was to shame one's ancestors, to become less than human. His trembling hand groped for the small dagger strapped to his belt, the tanto each pilot carried for that final act of loyalty. He could end it now, before they reached him, before shame could stain his soul, but his fingers were numb, his strength gone. The dagger slipped from his grasp and vanished beneath the waves. All he could do was float, helpless, as the enemy closed in. "Rescue boat off the starboard bow," came a voice in English, loud, sharp, alien. Hiroshi's breath caught as a massive gray destroyer loomed overhead. It slowed as it approached, its enormous hull casting a long shadow over the wreckage-strewn water. On the deck, figures in khaki uniforms peered down at him, shouting orders. "Got a live one here. Throw the line. Easy, boys. He's still breathing." The splash of a rope ladder beside him jolted Hiroshi from his daze. He tried to swim away, but his body no longer obeyed. Muscles refused to move, and his vision blurred at the edges. Then a hand, firm, calloused, human, seized his wrist. No, Hiroshi rasped, feebly pushing against it. "Yamero, yamero. Stop, stop." But the hand held fast. Another joined it, then another. He felt himself being hauled upward, his soaked flight suit dragging heavily as the sailors grunted and strained. His vision went white as he was lifted over the railing and laid gently on the deck. The world tilted. Boots clanged on steel. Voices shouted in a language he barely understood. Someone pressed a canteen to his lips, and cool water flooded his mouth. He coughed violently, choking, but then drank greedily, his thirst overwhelming his fear. "Easy, buddy." Easy, a voice said, not with hatred or scorn, but with something like concern. Hiroshi blinked. A man knelt beside him, his face sunburned and streaked with sweat. He wore a strange round helmet and a patch with a white star on his sleeve. His eyes, blue, not brown, studied Hiroshi with curiosity and something else he hadn't expected. Compassion. The prisoner. They carried him below deck, past rows of sailors who paused to stare. Some spat curses. Jap pilot, murderer, lucky bastard. Others simply looked at him in silence. Hiroshi stared straight ahead, ashamed to meet their eyes. He was laid on a narrow cot in the ship's infirmary. A medic, a tall man with gentle hands, cleaned the cuts on his face and wrapped bandages around his burned arm. They spoke softly to each other in English, their words incomprehensible, but strangely soothing. Name? One asked. Kneeling beside him, Hiroshi hesitated. Giving his name felt like betrayal, but his mouth moved before he could stop it. Tanaka, Hiroshi. The man nodded. Hiroshi, I'm Doc Carter. You're safe now. Safe. The word meant nothing. Safe was a tatami mat under the cherry trees. His mother's voice calling him for dinner. His sister's laughter on summer nights. This, lying wounded on an enemy ship, was not safety. It was humiliation, and yet they treated him with dignity. They brought him broth and bread, even though he could barely lift the spoon. They gave him blankets and water. No one struck him. No one screamed in his face. One evening, a young sailor, barely older than Hiroshi himself, approached his cot with a mug of coffee. Here, he said, gesturing for Hiroshi to take it. It's hot. Helps. Hiroshi stared at the cup suspiciously. Why? He croaked, his English halting. Why? Help me? The sailor shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Because you're alive, and because you'd do the same for me. Would he? The question gnawed at Hiroshi long after the sailor had gone. Would he have saved a downed American pilot? Or would he have watched him sink beneath the waves, nameless and forgotten? The answer unsettled him. Honor and humanity. Days passed. His strength returned. He began to understand snatches of English. Simple words like eat, sleep, rest, enemy, home. The Americans treated his wounds, gave him fresh clothes, and even allowed him brief walks on deck under guard. It was on one such walk that Hiroshi saw the ocean again. Calm, endless, beautiful. The same ocean that had nearly claimed his life. The same ocean that now separated him from his homeland. A shadow fell across the deck. Hiroshi turned to see the same sailor who had offered him coffee standing beside him. Quite a view, huh? The man said. Hard to believe we were trying to kill each other a few days ago. Hiroshi hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he said softly. Hard to believe. The sailor leaned on the railing, staring out at the horizon. My name's Jack, he said. My brother's in the Marines. He fought on Saipan. Says your guys fought like demons there. Brave as hell. Brave. Hiroshi repeated the word, tasting it on his tongue. Not brave, duty. Yeah, Jack said. Same thing, maybe. They stood in silence for a while. The only sound the crash of waves against the hull. It was strange, surreal, to feel a connection with someone who, days ago, would have killed him without hesitation. Stranger still to feel that the enemy was not the monster he had been taught to hate. Hiroshi stared out across the Pacific and felt something shift inside him. Something deep and fundamental. He had lost his aircraft, his mission, his honor. But perhaps in losing them, he had found something far more dangerous. Understanding. For the first time since the war began, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka was forced to confront a possibility he had never considered, that the enemy was not a demon or a beast, but a man who laughed, feared, hoped, and dreamed just as he did. And that realization, more than any defeat or captivity, was what truly stunned him. The sea that had nearly taken Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka's life was calm and silent as the American destroyer steamed towards the island of Oahu. Days had passed since his capture, but the memory of that day, the crash, the water, the hands pulling him from the abyss, still burned vividly in his mind. At night, when the ship's engines lulled the crew to uneasy sleep, Hiroshi lay awake on his narrow bunk, staring at the steel ceiling and questioning everything he had once believed. He had been raised to think of Americans as monsters, cruel, soulless invaders who would desecrate his homeland and mock his emperor. Yet these monsters had saved his life. They had given him water and food. They had treated his wounds, and most bewildering of all, they had spoken to him not as a defeated enemy, but as a fellow human being. What did that mean for a man who had been taught that death was preferable to capture? What did it mean for a soldier who had pledged to sacrifice everything for the emperor? Even his name, his family, his soul. He did not yet have the answers, but he knew that the man who had taken off from the Shinano was not the same man who now watched the American coastline rise from the horizon. The camp, the prisoner of war camp at Halewa, on the north shore of Oahu, was not what Hiroshi expected. Instead of dark dungeons or torture chambers, as imperial propaganda had promised, it was a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles, but they were not cruel. They were watchful, cautious, and, in their own way, respectful. Hiroshi was processed like the hundreds of other captured Japanese servicemen before him. He was fingerprinted, photographed, issued a number, and assigned a bunk in a long barracks that smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet canvas. The men around him were pilots, sailors, soldiers, some wounded, some bitter, some broken. The first days were the hardest. Every waking moment was a battle, not against hunger or mistreatment, but against shame. Shame for surviving when so many had died. Shame for being captured when his comrades had chosen suicide. Shame for breathing when Kenji Zero had burned and fallen into the sea. Some prisoners whispered about escape. Others prayed quietly in the corner of the barracks, seeking forgiveness for their disgrace. One man tried to hang himself with a length of bedsheet during the second week. Hiroshi understood them. He had felt the same darkness coiling inside his chest, but something, perhaps the memory of that outstretched American hand, perhaps the faint echo of his mother's voice, kept him from stepping over that edge. Conversations weeks turned into months. Life in the camp settled into a monotonous rhythm. Wake up at dawn, line up for roll call, eat the bland but plentiful meals, perform labor under guard, attend language classes or lectures if one chose. The Americans seemed determined not to break their prisoners but to understand them, and, in a strange way, to educate them. One afternoon, Hiroshi sat alone on a bench near the fence, staring out toward the green hills beyond. The sun was warm. The breeze carried the scent of plumeria blossoms. It was a world away from the screaming skies of war. Mind if I sit? It was Jack, the same young sailor from the destroyer. He was off duty now, wearing a clean white uniform and carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. Hiroshi hesitated, then nodded. Jack handed him a cup and sat beside him, both men staring out through the fence. "You've been here a while," Jack said. "How are they treating you?" Hiroshi searched for the right words. "Not like enemy." Jack smiled faintly. "That's good to hear. Because you're not. Not anymore, anyway. Still enemy, Hiroshi said quietly. War not finished. True, Jack admitted. But the war's not gonna last forever. One day it'll end. And when it does, we'll all have to figure out how to live with each other again. Hiroshi looked down into his coffee, watching the steam curl into the warm air. Hard to imagine. Maybe, Jack said, but not impossible. My grandfather fought the Spanish in the Philippines. 10 years later, he was trading goods with them. Things change. The two men sat in silence for a long time. The fence, once a symbol of Hiroshi's shame, now seemed less like a cage and more like a boundary, one that might one day come down. Letters from home in early 1945. The first Red Cross mail shipment reached the camp. Prisoners lined up eagerly for news of their families. Some wept openly as they read their letters. Others sat in stunned silence, clutching envelopes as though they might vanish. Hiroshi's letter was written in his mother's careful, flowing script. My dearest son, word reached us that your plane was lost over the Pacific. We prayed for your safe return, and though you are far from us, knowing you are alive brings us peace. Your sister has grown strong. She waits for your return beneath the cherry blossoms. I do not care if you wear a uniform or not. You are my son, and that is enough. Tears blurred the ink. All his life, Hiroshi had believed his worth was measured by his service, his sacrifice, his obedience. Yet here, in his mother's simple words, was a truth deeper than duty. That he was loved, not for his honor, but for his existence. The end of war on August 15th, 1945, the news swept through the camp like a storm. Japan had surrendered. The Emperor himself had spoken, his voice broadcast across the airwaves, declaring the end of the war. The reactions among the prisoners were mixed. Some fell to their knees and wept. Others shouted in disbelief. A few raged against the shame of defeat. Hiroshi felt none of those things. Instead, he felt a strange, overwhelming relief. It was over. The killing, the hatred, the endless, gnawing fear. Over Jack found him that evening, sitting by the fence as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson. So, Jack said, leaning against the wire, "What will you do now?" Hiroshi stared out at the horizon. "I do not know. Go home. See my family. Plant trees. Live. A simple life." Jack chuckled. "That sounds like a good plan." Hiroshi turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "I never thanked you," he said slowly, "for saving me, for showing kindness." "You don't have to thank me," Jack said. "We were enemies, sure, but enemies are just people on the other side of a line. People like you, like me." The two men stood there in silence, the fence between them suddenly meaningless. Epilogue, a changed Sky 5. Years later, in the spring of 1950, Hiroshi Tanaka stood on the deck of a merchant vessel bound for San Francisco. The war was over. Japan was rebuilding, and Hiroshi, now a civilian, was part of a trade delegation helping to forge new bonds between former enemies. The ocean was the same, vast, deep, eternal. But Hiroshi was not. The man who had once been willing to die rather than be captured was now a man who believed in bridges instead of barriers, in understanding instead of hatred. As the ship cut through the waves, Hiroshi lifted his gaze to the wide blue sky. It was the same sky where once he had fought and killed. Now it was simply beautiful. "Kenji," he murmured softly, thinking of his fallen friend. "We were warriors, but now I choose to live." And somewhere far behind him, across the great Pacific, cherry blossoms fell gently on a quiet Tokyo street, welcoming home a son who had found his way back, not through victory, but through mercy.